And welcome to another episode of MetaViews. This is our weekly salon where we bring together some of our MetaViews members, partly for the purposes of getting to know each other and to socialize, but also to center around a particular topic so that we might have not just a focused conversation, but an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to share, an opportunity really to mobilize knowledge. And this week, for better or for worse, we've chosen really not so much a controversial topic, maybe, dare I say it, a depressing topic, but an important one that we should be having a sober public conversations on, and it's the pandemic. And where we think the pandemic is going, how we're coping with the pandemic, and really what our strategies might be for the weeks and months to come, as certainly in my own case, I'm skeptical as to whether this pandemic is going to end anytime soon. Although I do think as a species, as a society, we're adapting and we're learning and we're trying to make the most of it, but it sure as heck ain't easy. Now, usually these salons are kind of open conversations and meant to really be dialogue based, but we usually ask one of our members to kind of start things off, to give either a position statement or ask questions or share some anecdotes or research that they've encountered. This week, we've asked Jeanette Herla to sort of be our lead or to jump first. Partly because Jeanette happens to be a doctor in medical history. And so, even though you're sort of a generalist in a broad sense, that your curiosity leads you to all sorts of different paths, I kind of feel that the pandemic is the really kind of subject that brings together a bunch of your intellectual pursuits and scholarly backgrounds, for lack of a better word. So I don't want to say too much more in terms of intro. I'm really hoping you'll set the stage, both in terms of helping us wrap our heads around the pandemic, but also what you would like to see us discuss here for the next hour or so.
So I'm just going to apologize because I am going to talk for a little bit here, but I did want to start by referencing the newsletter yesterday, and particularly the news about what happened in Manaus, which is a place I'm kind of obsessed with for totally different reasons connected to Herzog's Fitzcarraldo, but that's a topic for another day. But if you didn't read it or you don't recall, in a nutshell, Manaus had a terrible first wave outbreak, like just a fantastic amount of mortality. And there was the thought that the silver lining in all this was, okay, now we've achieved herd immunity, we should be good. And it turned out that wasn't the case at all, that they got hit with a second wave, and it's a particular variant labeled P1. So that's different from B117, the UK variant that's circulating now, and then also B135, the South African one. And P1 turned out to be even worse. The second wave, it just accelerated. So there's a couple different ideas about what this means. It could be, for example, maybe they never did really achieve the level of herd immunity that was estimated to exist. It could mean that this particular variant, has mutated enough that the immune response from the first infection would be insufficient to prevent infection. But the one that I find most terrifying, and then I'll talk about why that is that it's increased its transmissibility, that it's just hella contagious compared to what was already a pretty contagious infection. And the reason I find that the sort of the doomsday scenario has a lot to do with the stuff that kind of has interested me as someone who spent a lot of time looking at medical culture, and in particular medical responses to epidemics. That was kind of a minor area when I was doing my doctoral studies, and pandemics actually, because we had some of those some really big ones in the 19th century, and just to try and give you a sense of the idea that concerns me. I mean, obviously we can talk about all kinds of other stuff. So the thing I was interested in looking at when I was doing that kind of work was how the medical professions use their monopoly on a specialized discourse about health matters, essentially to build up professional status. And so the quick and dirty way of saying that is, if you name it, you own it. And so much of medicine is about fixing a label on something, coming up with a theory of how something works. The most obvious example I can give of that is anatomical diagrams. So if I show you an anatomical drawing of the inside of the human body, you can look at that and say, oh, I understand. There's the heart, there are the lungs, there are the intestines. If you open up a human body, not that I've done this, but I've butchered plenty of chickens recently, and so I have a pretty visceral sense of how messy the actual reality of the inside of a body is. It does not look like that diagram. You do not open it up and go, oh yes, there's this, everything is where it should be. There's a very wide range of individual variation. And that's kind of the shell game that medicine plays. It offers us this idea. I mean, I'm talking about scientific medicine, right? Like for Western medicine, 18th century onwards, this idea that the body, that health, these are things that are comprehensible, that we can grasp through reason, that we can attach names to and understand and control what's happening. That theory has this kind of, and the discursive universe that goes with it, all the names and the labels, that offers that promise of some kind of control. But of course, reality is so much more messy. And one example is the reality of what disease looks like when it manifests in a body. But of course, the other reality, and to come back to the epidemics, this is the thing I'm especially interested in, is you'll notice that as medical theory, and especially the scientific version of that, gains ascendance, so do narratives. If you look at doctors' case histories, this is really fascinating. Narratives that blame the patient when things went wrong. Because I, the doctor, did everything I was supposed to do according to my understanding of treating this disease. Things didn't work out. Clearly the patient fucked up, right? That's got to be it, that they did something that they weren't supposed to do. They didn't comply. They didn't follow my advice.
You're talking about blaming the patient.
Right,
and the extent to which that this frame has been set up that's so sterile, that makes it seem as if, health and medicine can be contained and controlled. Yeah. But that's an illusion.
Well, and that's where, so this is where this talk of what nowadays we talk about as the social determinants of health, right? All those factors that influence health, whether it's your socioeconomic status, whether it's your status as a racialized minority, where you live. Like, there are so many of these possible influences that have a genuine and kind of large impact on your health, quite aside from the form of healthcare that you are receiving or not. What's so interesting about this is that those things are they're very specific, right? I mean, again, they're introducing another level of individual variation. And when I was looking at these 19th century pandemics, one of the things that was so fascinating was the conflicts that would arise. Like, if you look at, for instance, at colonial India and the outbreaks of smallpox or cholera or plague even, that colonial medical officers were attempting to contain, the constant struggle is they have no way of imagining what the patient's reality is, right? That, hey, maybe these colonial subjects are coming at something like smallpox with an entirely different understanding of what it is. I mean, in that case, it might be conceptualized as a Hindu deity by some of those people, and therefore their response would be inflected by a religious tradition. and or in a, I guess what I'm trying to get to, and I'm going to wrap up now, is that what has been so fascinating to me about the pandemic we're living in right now, is that gap between theory and practice. Imagine if the public health messaging had been actually on point, which we all know it hasn't been. It's been abysmal. Imagine if the government response in North America had been on point. It clearly has not been. I think we would still be vulnerable to an infection that was highly transmissible, in part because this gap between what we're supposed to do, what we actually do, and the failure to imaginatively engage with why people do what they do. That maybe you don't self-isolate because you can't afford to. You have no personal space to separate yourself from your multi-generational family. Or maybe you think that 6 feet is going to keep you safe indoors because you cannot actually conceptualize, for a bunch of different reasons, the idea of airborne transmission, which is completely invisible and is hard. It's abstract, right? It's if you're a concrete thinker, that's a tough one to wrap your brain around. So this is a long way of saying that I think that gap between the promise that we had this sort of arrogance, I think, all along that, oh, well, we're in the 21st century. We have this amazing medical science. Look how fast we made this vaccine. We got this. Never takes into account, yes, but people and what people do. And that if it was as simple as just patching this, that we would be on a better footing than we are now. But conversely, and this really is my final thought, the virus itself we tend to think of as a thing, but of course, and it's not alive. It's a virus. It's not alive in the sense of a more classic biological entity, but it is evolving, right? It has the same kind of, Jesse at the beginning talked about how we're adapting. Yeah, sure, we're adapting. It's adapting faster, and it's finding those weaknesses. The adaptations are driven relentlessly by what's successful, right? Viruses that are super lethal tend not to be successful because they kill too many people in a big dramatic way. Everyone freaks out and takes it seriously. What's really dangerous is the virus that kills silently, that is like the boiling water that ramps up on you and you don't see it coming. And this is the situation I worry we find ourselves in now. Okay, I am done.
Well, and that was brilliant. And, since we already interrupted you for Twitch purposes, allow me to do so again and say you should isolate that from the video and put it out as just a talk unto itself, because I thought that was fascinating. And if anything, what you helped reinforce for me in terms of my own perception of this pandemic and where it is that it's the quantification bias. Right? That, to your point, we've been dying from stuff all the time. And if that stuff is silent, right? If that stuff is below the radar, we ascribe it to other causes like heart failure or lungs or cancer because we don't have the capacity to go and look what's there. And yet what I feel is as the perfect timing of this pandemic is it comes at a moment in which we obsess data and we fetishize data and we think that technology is the solution to all that cures us. So I agree with you that this virus is working faster than us. It's adapting faster than us. And that's why I don't see any end to this pandemic anytime soon. But what I do see is an ongoing race to quantify and measure and surveil everything related to transmission, to health, to public space. And so my fear, and maybe it's not a fear, my concern is that yes, we're not going to beat this pandemic this year, maybe, or maybe even not 2022, although I'm not ready to make that call. But are we going to identify other threats that have always been amidst us, that have always been haunting us and preying upon us, but we were blissfully ignorant of? And now that we start to quantify and measure that threat, does that empower the dysfunctional response, the blanket response, rather than a customized or precision or responsive response. And that's part of, from a technology perspective, where I see this dynamic playing out. But I express that rather unhelpfully as just my own anxiety, but not necessarily something that I feel that I'm, or that we are necessarily in a position to address. So I'm curious to hear from others. I'm curious to kind of open the floor and hear if other people have reactions to Jeanette or questions for Jeanette, or just their own thoughts and analysis on where this pandemic is and where we're headed from here. I mean, David, I'll pick on you only because you're one of the only... Oh, no, Stro put up his hand. By all means, Stro.
I'm just wondering, are we assuming that, we have, if we handled it well, we would have eradicated this pandemic by now? If the systems in place were actually working the way they're supposed to and we were prepared for it, was there a solution, or have we created more problems by not having a solution? And then therefore, is the thing that we're actually identifying going through this pandemic, is there real systemic problems like capitalism, for example, that create, or perpetuate problems or create bigger problems?
I think that's fair. And to your point, basic issues like housing and hunger and poverty are obviously exacerbated. To, Jeanette's point of some people don't even have the option of having physical distance. Ninja, you wanted to jump in?
I was just going to say, I think that at the beginning of this pandemic, there was an idealistic belief that we would all band together as one single humanity and fight this together. Mm-hmm. And based on cultural differences and political differences, that of course hasn't happened. And there's good reasons for that. We're more like Americans than we are like the Chinese culture. So we are going to be very individualistic, and everything that's happening in America, almost in retrospect, was predictable in my mind.
Tragically, but true. John, you had your hand up?
Sure. I think we've spoken about how there's probably three strong ways that people can deal with this. This is the no human rights China martial law, stay in your room, contain the virus, or take a bullet. There's the North American freedom is more important, go join a rally and you'll die before we get to herd immunity. And then there's the middle of the road, some of the European cultures that have a very strong bureaucratic health organization. But I think all of them are still more interested in establishing their power structure in the face of the virus than in combating it. And I think that's a reality for any organization, is how do I maintain my elitism and my strength base? And that's the priority. So as I asked Jeanette, what do we do? How do we keep our electeds and our elites honest? And I think that's a problem that we're facing in pretty much everything we talk about.
I agree entirely. I kind of feel that the politics of this pandemic is what we're missing, right? That there has almost been, and this is true generally of kind of liberal politics, that when there's a crisis, people feel that it's not the right time for politics. And yet I'm of the opposite mind. Now is the time for politics. Now is when we should be talking about the scarce resources of society and who we should be protecting and how we're all in it together. On the one hand, that frustrates me that it's not happening. But on the other hand, I feel that the attempted insurrection in Washington, D.C. was a reflection of that politics, because those are people who legitimately don't agree with the way in which the pandemic has been handled. And so they're protesting that. They're revolting. I wish there were more than the far right who were becoming more politically active when it comes to talking about how we should handle this, talking about what measures we need, talking about how we foster a culture that gets everyone together, because it is going to take a cooperative or collaborative effort. Now, David, I wanted to throw to you earlier, partly because I always love your contributions in the salon, but obviously this is a subject area that you both have a lot of expertise in, but that I've literally looked up to you for, in terms of the way in which you've provided a critique of the healthcare system and its inability to collaborate and its inability to handle, complex realities and complex diagnoses.
With regard to, thanks, Jesse. With regard to, I need to monetize that. With regard to almost everything that's been said, I would say, somebody said, what do you think about that? I would say, do you believe it? I'd say yes and no. Like I both agree and disagree with almost everything that has been said. I do agree, for example, that public health is like mental health in a way, in being the great ignored. Mm-hmm. It may be the newest great ignored, because the healthcare system was developed to deal with, in the Western world anyway, to deal with the preservation of industrial human resource, not to preserve the health and well-being. But at the same time, I think, having worked deeply in healthcare, I see the most extraordinary accomplishments that have been done that we shouldn't overlook. So, with regard to what Jeanette said at the beginning, with regard to contagious, I read that article, or an article about that this morning, and so my question is, do we actually know that they're more contagious? Mm-hmm. I don't think, I think the determinants of this situation are so multiply determined that it's really hard to be able to make definitive statements about things like that. And with regard to the contagion, this is just a commentary about that. Shrita and I rattle on about this all the time, as we have the British virus and the South African virus and the Brazilian virus. I think this is a false way of looking at things. I think what we have is a virus that mutates. And pretty soon we'll have the Toronto virus. But there'll be an Almont virus, for God's sakes, because that's what viruses do.
Actually, we do have an Almont virus. It's called Randy Hillier. But I digress. Please continue.
And then with regard to we got this, that hubris that we've seen. Most people that I know don't feel that don't feel that hubris. They feel confused and mixed up and frightened, and there are some who feel that way. Donald Trump has been the most evident. In fact, in regard to the way that North America, particularly America, handled this, I think there were two things that really were problematic in terms of getting this under control. One was Trump, and the other was the confusion around masks. Because the messaging around masks initially, from even the sainted, and I really believe this guy probably could be sainted, whose name I've forgotten,
Dr. Fauci,
that tiny little physician.
Dr. Fauci.
When the thing came around, there were insufficient F95 masks for hospitals. Mm-hmm. And instead of saying, don't try to use F95 masks because we have to preserve them for the folks who are in the front line of the healthcare business, what they told everyone was, don't wear masks. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the issue of wearing a mask became more problematic. Mm-hmm. When I heard about this contagion, I started making masks. Even though people said, well, you don't need to mask. So, it's that bizarre politicalization of the thing from the Trump perspective. And then another confusion, just a supply chain confusion. Mm-hmm. And who would have known that those two together would have led to such extraordinary complications? And then with regard to the hubris of the health professionals who feel as if their patients fuck up, they do fuck up. Like yesterday I had to go, and the other day I had to go and get a stress EKG. And I was all planned. I had telephone calls about it. I went to the wrong hospital. And they sent me across the road to another hospital. It was the wrong hospital. I ended up was masked 4 times and went through the procedure 4 times before eventually getting to a hospital that actually had 16 floors. At the same time, I think there is an element of, so, I think we do screw up. We don't get it right. We don't hear, but at the same time, I think the health system fucks up too. And I used to work in geriatrics, caring for older people, and I remember I fought back about a headline that came up from, I think, the New England Journal of Medicine a while ago. It was a headline that said 30% of family members do not understand their elderly families do not understand their elderly family members' wishes about advance directives. And that was a criticism of families from the godlike physicians. And my pushback was, well, but that's 30%, but 60% do, for crying out loud. We have a headline that says 60% do understand. So again, it's this yes and no, yet this yes and no about most of the things that. And if we make an assertion and then say yes and no, usually you've got the right answer.
Yes and no, David. But let me also point out that Stroh has his hand up, and then I'll throw to Jeanette. Stroh?
So again, I don't. Is it possible to make this pandemic go away without like a dictatorship, basically, to bring everybody on the same page, right? There's some solidarity, because it seems that everybody, even within the healthcare system, is fragmented. Their resources, their ideas of what this is and what this isn't, and how to deal with it, and obviously the politicians that have the control of the healthcare system, because they're actually the ones that fund it. I don't know. Can we ever go back to a world that doesn't have a pandemic going on?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. How do we answer that question?
I'm on the exact same spot, Stroh, that I struggle with that question as well. And as a zealous Democrat, as a faithful Democrat, I feel my faith being challenged, because I don't have confidence in the current slate of elected officials, and short of electoral reform, I don't have confidence that we're going to get a new slate of bums that's going to be able to handle this. Now, I'm still 100% in favor of democracy, so my response is we need a democratic resurgence. We need a democratic renewal. We need to look at how democracy can be revived to address this challenge. But that itself may be a future salon for us to tackle, because I think in and of itself it is a very huge discussion. Now, Jeanette, you had your hand up, and then Sharita, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to respond to what Stroh said, but I'm going to do it by going back to what John said earlier, which was about, this idea that pandemics lay bare the mechanisms of power, right? They make explicit the politics that maybe it was easier to ignore under a less crisis-driven situation. And so we do see different flavors of political response to this crisis, but I would also say that the pandemic has exposed certain uncomfortable truths, like the fact that there's capitalism basically rests on a kind of blood sacrifice, right? That we're gonna take the life force out of the lower classes and turn that into surplus value and profit for the classes that control the means of production. And that's just the way it is. That blood sacrifice becomes pretty clear when the thinking is, well, the economy, we're just going to have to sacrifice the olds and the poors to keep the economy running. Like it makes it explicit what was already there. David, I knew you could resist.
No, I'm sorry, Jeanette. It was just Lily just came in. Our dog came in, and I was waving at the dog.
So I kind of feel like if we are going to address this thing in any kind of way other than letting it run its course, which of course will be terrible, right? That's going to be devastating and have a massive impact. I think it has to be at the level of politics and getting real about what is going on there and maybe changing some of that stuff. So it's kind of an optimistic moment for me. I feel like we have, I grew up in the 80s, which was like the era of terrible apathy about politics and kind of an exception, an acceptance of the status quo as immovable. And that's, that's the stereotype about Gen X, that they're just like, oh, whatever, we're not going to be able to change anything. But I feel like this is a moment where it's like change or die.
Well, and you recall that period, right? There was the false notion of the end of history.
Yeah.
That created that kind of rigidity. I agree with you. Thank God that's gone. Now, for those of us following along on Twitch, our comrade David Fingroot just posted a link to a great research paper on blood sacrifice and the nation revisiting civil religion. So for those of you on Twitch, you have the benefit of that hyperlink to go and check out that paper. For you guys here, I will add it to our chat, but I will do so in a moment. But I offer that as a brief acknowledgement of our fellow traveler in the Twitch chat and rewarding him for being there. But with that said, Sharita, you've got your hand up. Why don't you jump in?
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, to go way back to the beginning, I actually did do dissections on cadavers. And although it was, really interesting, the first thing that you really do learn, as you said, Jeanette, is that they're all different. And if you try to find, a certain nerve going through a certain muscle, it's, you really need somebody there who's seen like 100, and they will tell you, oh, I think it's that. And the operative word is I think. Because yes, we're all different and etc. The other thing that I want to say is I don't think this pandemic is going to end. Mm-hmm. I hope that we learn something from this. There's a part of me that is not necessarily that hopeful, but I hope we can come away with at least a couple of things from this. Perhaps some kind of better long-term care. Mm-hmm. For people who are elderly and can't take care of themselves. Perhaps changing our ideas as to what are essential work, essential services. Truck drivers, factory workers, they're often essential. Mm-hmm. Maybe even more essential than teachers. God forbid I say that. I'm just saying that we have an opportunity to flip this. Whether we flip it or not, I'm not sure. I just hope we walk away with some little bit more knowledge about how complex health and or disease is. They're not the same, but how complex it is.
Well, hopefully public health will grow.
Yes, hopefully public health will grow.
Hopefully we'll develop vaccine production capability in Canada.
Well, and I do think to that point, David, I think vaccination as a subset of medical science is having its renaissance, right? It's having a boom. And I think that is going to have tremendous positive effects. In the same way that I think, David's point about distributed production, right? The fact that the Canadian government may have its own lab online by the summer is encouraging. I would also love to see intellectual property reform. Right? I mean, these vaccines should obviously be in the public domain. They should not be proprietary. And the science around it should be open and collaborative. But these are, as we've mentioned, political discussions. And unfortunately, they're not really happening in the public sphere or even in Parliament at a level that I think is necessary. And that is frustrating. Sorry, go ahead, Sharita, but then we're going to throw to Ninja, who's got her hand up.
Go away from the idea that the vaccine is going to be the magic bullet.
Agreed.
There are no magic bullets.
Yeah. And that's my frustration. Part of the reason I wanted to hold this salon today is I'm so fed up with the media narratives that fetishize the vaccine and make it seem, that create the expectation that this pandemic is going to end soon. I was in a NetTime event yesterday. So this was an international Zoom of academics, and they all thought that they were going to be able to hold events in March, right? And if not March, probably May. And I just thought, my God, like these are people who are supposed to be smart, and yet they were clueless. Again, I digress. Ninja, please bail us out here.
Well, my question was, I've been reading a lot about what transmissibility means, and everything that I've read and listened to and heard and watched, I don't understand what this means when something is, when a virus is more transmissible. I don't understand that. It stays in the air longer. It stays on surfaces longer. What does it mean? Does anybody professional know in this group what that means?
I mean, unfortunately, we don't have any current professionals, but is there anyone who would like to make an educated guess as to what that means?
Higher viral load, in addition to
Jeanette, you wanted to jump in?
Virus? I don't know.
Additional spikes on the virus.
No.
No. That was
Jeanette, I think Jeanette wants to jump in. Go ahead.
Just wanted a clarification. Are you asking what are the mechanisms that makes the virus more transmissible, or are you asking about like what the impact of that would be?
No, I'm not asking right now what the impact would be. I'm asking what makes a virus more transmissible than its former mutation or its former variant.
And if you could do that briefly, Jeanette.
I mean, the short answer is it could be so many different things. And that's what actually makes it really hard. Like, that's the genius of the virus, right? If it was just one thing, we could target that and say, oh, all the current vaccines are focused on the spike, right? The coronavirus spike. And that's why right now a lot of experts are saying, oh, don't worry, these vaccines, they might not be super awesome the way they are on the regular variant, but they'll still attack these new variants.
Jeanette, is there really a spike? Do
Yes,
they really have spikes, or is spike just a mental image?
No, there is actually, the thing that the virus uses to attach to the receptors it attacks looks like a spike. That's why they call it the spike.
Or is it in the minds of medical illustrators? or is there something about?
See, now if we were using Twitch overlays, this is where David would get like points for ding, 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 because he made a rhetorical score in that, and it was cleverly done. Now, John, the reason I was asking Jeanette to be short is I noticed you had your hand up and you posted some fascinating stuff in the chat. So I want to bring you back up if you could sort of verbally, for the benefit of those watching at home who may not be able to read the tiny font that it's displayed on the screen, if you might share what you just share with us what you just shared in the chat.
In my circuitous rants, most likely I was talking about how we've got a lot of basic things we need to do. I posted a link about how people could take a look at what increased viral load means and why the sky isn't really falling. But there's a basic level of hygiene and education that we all have to get together on that will allow us to live in, the world went through bubonic plagues and Black Death, and a lot of people came through. Then again, we didn't have Twitter back then. But it really has come down to what everything else does. Like you said, the tentacles of politics, and I hate to say it, we're not living up to our terms of use as end users. We have to start challenging the corporation of society on what they're telling us, because if we have two realities, we're never going to get together on how we're supposed to act. And as long as we have people ignoring some common rules, who was with me in the beginning days of this epidemic when we all saw those cute videos about putting pepper flakes in water and soap and seeing how the pepper flakes moved away, and we all went, oh, but we seem to have forgotten even that basic level. It behooves us that we all have to kind of have these discussions with each other and our crazy relatives again.
Well, I mean, it's funny you say that, because I do feel that there is a circular nature to the conversations and the threads and the knowledge. I feel for us that, that circular nature is iterative, and that every cycle we're making a little more progress and we're getting a little ahead of things. But it is frustrating when we feel that others aren't keeping up, when they're not keeping pace, when, we were talking about public health and hoping that public health is one of the beneficiaries coming out of our current phase of this pandemic, that we start to invest and recognize. But I think public education, as distinct from public health education, is also something that has to be central, and that has to be part of this, because it's not just the, how to wash your hands or how to understand kind of airborne transmission, but the larger notion of, how do I manage in this economy? How do I manage my mental health? How do I, there's so many areas in which knowledge is now crucial, and knowledge is essential in the way in which we're dealing with what we may be calling a perpetual pandemic. I mean, that I think gets into our larger political discussion. And maybe I'm also just flagging another future salon in terms of this being another substantive topic. Now, Murley, I'm going to pick on you only because we're at the point where I start drawing in people who haven't spoken yet. And I was actually going into that public education sort of piece or rant because I was going to throw to Neil Anderson, who unfortunately dropped out, anticipating perhaps that I was about... Oh, no, here he is. He's coming back in. It was just crappy internet, so you can't blame him. So, Murley, I'm going to throw to you in the interim. I'm curious for you to jump in any part of this conversation. Obviously, I don't feel where normally we kind of pick on you as our, token person under the age of 30. In this case, I don't think that applies, because I don't think you are in any way typical of your peers or your age group, in that you fundamentally understand what's going on with this pandemic and that it needs to be taken seriously. So I'm not going to pigeonhole you into that regard, but instead invite you to jump into the conversation as to where you think it's interesting, as to where your thoughts are moving forward as to its future.
Well, I've just been thinking, I'm not a very expert medical kind of person, but I'm thinking more on sort of a social level, how, there's going to be, if this pandemic goes on for another couple of years, there's going to be a whole sort of cohort of kids who went to high school during the pandemic, kids who went to middle school during the pandemic, and it's going to totally change sort of the experience of childhood and growing up. The other thing I was thinking about is how young people might formulate a sense of the dangers of the pandemic. I mean, we know that young people can be sort of more ignorant and have a bit of an invincibility complex, and can therefore be potential super spreaders. But I also feel like there's, in the same way that your grandkids might show you how to set an alarm on your phone, younger people might also have that ability, because, they can sometimes be more open to new ideas and learning, to understand the implications of the pandemic and the dangers, and that they might be a key part in kind of spreading that knowledge and awareness, and in general, just making people more aware. I think it can definitely go both ways, and that, the adults in their life and their peers can have an influence on that. But in the same way, you see a lot of young people advocating for climate activism. I feel like at a certain point, people are going to realize that it's their future. And if they want to not be living in a pandemic for, the rest of their teenage years, they're going to have to start taking it into their own hands as much as they can. Because I think young people are pretty disempowered when it comes to these kind of policy decisions and public health. And public health is a little abstract, but I think that they definitely have a an important role to play.
I think there's a paradox there, right? In that on the one hand, we sort of look to every new generation to shake things up and to be rebels and to really make a difference. And yet, on the one hand, this generation is going to have more reason to do that than ever, right? Their hormones, their biology is going to be driving them to get outside. If that can be channeled to politics, that has tremendous potential. But the paradox is there's so much language and narrative and physical boundaries from them doing that. So I think, again, future salon, I think that is a fascinating subject for us to explore a little deeper. Now, we've got 3 hands up. We've got David, who's got his hand up. We've got Jeanette, who has her hand up. We've got John, who's had her hand up. So we'll go in that order. But I ask all of you to be relatively brief because we are starting to wind down towards the end of the salon. And this is where I'll prime all of you to say that I do have an exercise I want to end with. And it's going to involve you using the thumbs up or the thumbs down feature that Zoom applies. So while others are talking, maybe familiarize yourself where that thumbs up and thumbs down is. So when the time comes, you're able to cast your perspective. David, you wanted to jump in?
Oh, I just, following up on Merle, I wonder if ignorance and the false sense of invincibility might be more equally distributed across the lifespan than we think.
Yes, definitely more than the youth. Jeanette, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I did. Am I muted or am I unmuted? Oh,
no, you're good.
Good. I just wanted to follow up real quick on what Merle said. So one of the issues with the medical profession in general has been health literacy among lay people has been conceived as come around to seeing things the way we see them. And I think what Merle has articulated, and John, I know this is a concept dear to your heart, is the idea of the patient, or in this case, just the general population, having that sense of ownership and also contributing what their perspective to how we look at illness and health and medical treatment and diagnosis, that it's not just this top down, that health literacy is defined by the perspective of the medical professionals. It's a two-way street. It's a collaboration. It's an interaction. And I think, Merle's point about the generation that lives with this is going to be the one who's going to have something to say about this is very much the point that, people who live with illness know their illness and their body better than anyone else. And damn right they have something to say about that and should be fully invested in the process of generating knowledge, of creating that discourse around the thing.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, sister. John, you had your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, real quick. I wanted to make a point about how all those hormones, Merle, great points, but I think it could go really fun, partially joking, partially serious. Imagine, what GameStop means to me in a year's time when people have all those pent-up hormones and decided that they're going to put $15 a month in a fund so they can enjoy the lulls of taking down a major corporation. And it's, I want you to take me seriously, or you or one of your buddies at the golf course is going to be the one in line for the next COVID check. And I really feel that the sense of anger and the sense of need and the sense of educating themselves through the humor of the internet, when you can learn about public policy through TikTok videos, I think you're onto that kind of Venn diagram that's going to actually change something, at least I hope.
And that's just it. Not to keep using the word paradox, but it does feel as if there's these contradictory forces at work, where on the one hand, we have every reason to believe that we're about to see the kind of democratic uprising, the kind of, user revolt that we've been thinking about since the early days of the internet in this technological or technocultural context. But on the other hand, you could totally see how all that energy could back a demagogue, right, could back the same type of authoritarianism that history has warned us about repeatedly. And so on the one hand, you have this great opportunity to be excited, but on the other hand, you have this great reason to be depressed and anxious and paranoid. And I find that exhausting, right? I feel that emotionally every day. I'm kind of going through these cycles. I mean, I'm a big fan of Adam Curtis, the British documentarian, and he's got a new series coming out next week that kind of addresses these issues. And he calls it an emotional history of the modern world. And so I'm looking forward to it. I'm probably going to end up streaming it on Twitch, kind of live reaction, because I'm, BBC, come at me if you want to have a copyright battle. Let's go. But I kind of feel that this is a great time to be alive, even though it's also a shitty time to be alive. I mean, I offer that as a contradiction. Neil, I wanted to bring you in a few points in which I assume you were having some internet connectivity, because every time I was about to throw to you, you kind of dropped out. I'm curious for you to jump in and hear your thoughts in general around the pandemic or around any of the threads that we brought up here in today's session.
My experience has been so disjointed, I don't think I'm qualified to comment, because I was, first of all, having great difficulties coming in and out. And so I hear the first half of somebody's statement and the second half of someone else's. And so I'm loath to stick my foot in my mouth. I like what you're saying about democracy, though, and I think it's really interesting. I think the pandemic and the internet are really impacting democracy, and what we doing in the Association for Media Literacy is looking at the way that the pandemic especially has changed the figure-ground relationship and has made us see so many things. And Jeanette, in half of her statement that I heard, made reference to the fact that things are being revealed. And I think it's going to help us. I think it's going to help us see these things. And what we need is the second half of that. It's where we need to take some action. We need to figure out what action to take, and then we have to take it.
It's both of those, I feel, are very difficult steps collectively that we still don't have. I don't even know if we certainly don't have consensus. I don't think if we have a super majority, a 66%, although I think some polls come close. And then what to do about it, that's where there's even greater division, right? Because, my first response to the pandemic last March, I believe it was no rent, no mortgages, right? If you're asking people to stay home, then eliminate the stress of the home and then address homelessness because hotels are empty. Boom, all of a sudden you could start housing people. Basic common sense that months later, that's still not even a debate, right? I mean, that's not even remotely close to the debate. So while frustrated, I think today's session has given all of us simultaneously opportunity to see hope, but at the same time, perhaps resolve that this is a marathon and we haven't even done the first mile of the 26 miles that it may have to do. Now, we did get a comment just now in the chat from our friend Atul, who couldn't turn on his mic and camera, unfortunately. So I will read it out. This pandemic has made me think that just as we are all connected to the billions of bacteria in our gut, in the same way, all of us are connected to a larger global ecosystem, Gaia. Maybe in the long term, humans will overcome the need for national borders, perhaps also eliminate for economic classes and strata. Bravo, right? I mean, I think that's a sub-thread to our discussion, certainly. And I think the metaphor you draw between the interdependence with our bacteria and the interdependence with all living things is exactly the insight we should be getting from this moment in history, if only so that we start appreciating our soil and how fragile that is in terms of our food supply and in terms of our environment. I mean, we're pretty much running out of time, but I'm curious if any of you guys have any final thoughts, comments, hopes for where this discussion could go in the future, whether future salons or future issues? No? Okay. Then our last exercise, which hopefully you've taken the time to locate the thumbs up or thumbs down button. I want you to give a thumbs up if you think the pandemic will end. It doesn't matter when, just that it'll end. And then give a thumbs down if you don't think the pandemic will end. at least not in any contemporary sense. You won't be held accountable, but I'm curious to see how people vote.
I don't have a thumbs down.
You do, you just gotta kind of dig it in Zoom. So if you want, you could just hold your thumb up. So if you don't want to look for the actual thing on the Zoom, hold your thumb up so I can get a sense of...
I would go like this.
Yeah, Ryan and David are both kind of doing the, the yes and no. We've got more thumbs up. John and Merle have a thumbs up. Neil has a thumbs up. My thumb's down. I'm assuming, Sharita, your thumb is down because of what you said. Greg's thumb is up. Jeanette, Ryan's now got a thumb up. Jeanette, you're still uncertain. Ninja's got a thumb up. All right, so we've got a majority saying this pandemic will end. That's reassuring, right? So those of us who are perhaps most paranoid, most worried, we're still in the minority. But unfortunately, we may have to revisit this subject in 6 months or so to see as to whether our forecasts have been improved. But I think that this has been a very therapeutic, if not cathartic, discussion. So I thank all of you for joining us. Thank our friends on Twitch and our friends in the future who are currently watching this on YouTube. Has the pandemic ended yet? Could you let us know? How far in the future do you have to be watching this to then post a comment below and tell us the pandemic is ended? That in and of itself might be an interesting historical artifact. And again, for those watching at home, this has been MetaViews. We're a network of curious people who like to explore the world critically. Metaviews.substack.com, MetaViews on Twitch, MetaViews on YouTube. We've got a daily show now on Twitch where we talk about technology and politics. And of course, our salons happen every Tuesday. So thanks again, everybody, for hanging out. And I hope to see you soon, if not next week, before that. Take care.
Thanks, Jess.